Okay, so I'm going to talk this morning on install profile driven development. So it's basically if you're building a site, a project for a client, situations where you may want to actually do that as an install profile. Just an overview of what we're going to present this morning is we're going to take a very quick look at a project that we applied this process to, or identify some of the reasons and the benefits of why we did it as an install profile, get into showing how we actually manage configuration around that process, and look at a couple of the gotchas that we had around the configuration management. So the project we looked at, we called it Doris. It's a digital object repository. It's basically a YouTube for a university, so they could upload videos, documents, etc. like that. So it basically had Doris, Drupal 8 as a front end, and we used the AWS transcoding services to transcode the videos, install those, and deliver them through the Drupal front end. So why do we use an install profile? So there's a few reasons for that. Because of the nature of the project, it was a bit like an application. We were looking at releasing it as open source once we were completed. So we wanted something that we could just put up as an install profile. You download it, install it, got your own little in-house YouTube to go. It gave us the ability to reuse it, so we could install multiple different versions of it with the same functionality. Gave us less reliance on the canonical database, at least for a period of time at the beginning before we released their site to production. It basically meant when you install it, you know it's in a known state. So look at that gotcha. When we started doing this, first thing we go, great, Drupal 8's got the new configuration management. This is great, we can export it, we can import it. So you create your install profile, bring up your site, you go and install it somewhere else, you export your config, you go to import it, and you butt up against this, which Drupal goes, hey, that's a different site, I'm not going to import your config because it's a different site. And you're like, but it's like exactly the same. And that was unexpected. So we came across this. I've asked around, I've talked to people, what is the precaution, what is the thing that you're trying to prevent? And the feedback I get essentially is that you don't want to go to a production site and actually import another site's config. And it's, yeah, from my point, that's an edge case. What are you doing in that situation in the first place? However, that's the state of play on it. So, what are the options we had? What could we do to manage the config when we're working this way? So we can't export it as a bulk config. So the first thing I did was hunt around and I found this configuration installer. And I went, this looks great, until I realized it's an install profile. I can't have two install profiles. This is not going to work for me. This actually looks pretty cool, but wasn't going to work for my needs. Hunted around, eventually found the configuration update manager, which is a pretty cool tool, which provides a page with reports. It tells you the state of what your default config is, what's changed, what's new, a few things like that. So, however, it means you need to export your content manually. So you can go in there, you can change your content, see what changed, but you've got to actually manually put that back into your config on disk. Would be nice if there was some tools in Drush, which probably pretty easy to do. I never got around to it. That'd actually do that and figure this out for you. Just don't have it yet. So our process of managing install profile. Basically, I'm not going to go into how to create an install profile in this session. It's just basically you create one, run it with Drush site install, and it sets up a site for you. Once you've done that, you can install the configuration update manager, which I do as a separate step, so that's not in config itself because you don't want that on production necessarily. And then you make some changes to your site, change some of the config. Then you can go to the configurations update manager page. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. Now, I actually wrote a patch for this as well because it didn't actually tell you which module, which profile, which theme provided each piece of content. I wrote a patch up there. I reviewed a couple of times. It's not perfect, but it gets the job done. So it ends up looking like this. So this is your report. You can see down the bottom you've got the change configuration options, and that patch puts this, you see the first one's from the Doris profile. and then click on export, and that will take you to, that's just a better view of what we're just looking at. And then, so I'll show you that in a sec. So basically we're going to copy and paste config out of the single config export thing in Drupal and put it into the file on disk ourselves in the modules config install directory, which means when you go and do your site install again, it'll bring in the new config. So after you click on export, you get to a page like this. Can't quite see it down the bottom. The file name you want to export to is down the bottom. So my manual process was just copy and paste that, find it on disk, open it up, copy and paste this code without the UUID and paste that in. And that's, you've just exported your piece of config. So you've got a whole process of, you can install it, you can change it, you can see what's changed, you can find that config, you put it on disk, and then reinstall your site. So just looking at where some of those places are on disk, you can see in our profile, we've got the config install, you've got all your config files there in the default install directory, and you can just overwrite them. Now, as you're working through a process like this, because we're basically building a generic application, but also a very client-specific one at the same time, there's going to be some configuration in there that we found was very client-specific. Now, we started this over a year ago, and now there's things like config split that can help you manage that. Don't know how to go in a default config sort of situation, but to manage that, we just had config that was specific to the client, to their particular site. We just put it in another module with their name in it and just put the config in there. So you just keep it out. So we end up going, you can install, and then when you turn their module on, it goes and changes the config and turns it into their version of the site. So we had a generic one and a customer-specific one. So after you export that config, you can test real easy by just going drush site install. Brings your site back up and should be functioning just as it was before. You will lose your content in that case, but when you're developing and you haven't released the production yet, it's there wasn't a lot of content in there anyhow, and it's easy to write a little script just to go and plug that in there if you want to. Didn't really, early in the project, we didn't need to do that a lot, so fast it didn't matter. And then when you first start working this way, you might find that you export config and you needed to export some of their dependencies as well and you missed them. So you go and run your site install and you come across this this error, which I'll get to in a moment. A couple of slides down, I'll show you how that works. Just this. Now, after we actually released and we had the site up and the client's actually putting proper content in there, at that point we can't go and do a site install over the top of their site anymore. They'll lose all their content and all their database. So in this case we still do the exact same process in our development, but whenever we export the config into the default config, we just write a little update hook to then go and revert that. And you can see in this case I just wrote a little function that can tell whether it just goes and sees if the config's in active storage or not. If it is, it knows to revert it. If it's not, it knows it's an import and calls the relevant function to do that. So you just pass the config type and config name to that function, and it reverts it back in an update hook. And then at that point, you still got your install profile still works, but the client version of the site can import the updated config as well. So here's the missing dependencies issue. Now sometimes after you've exported the config, you do your site install and you get this big error. And it basically goes, blah, 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 this particular thing's got unmet dependencies. And you're like, great, it's got some unmet dependencies, what are they? So after a bit of hunting around, I had this little tiny core hack on my dev environment. It's a core hack, yes, but I don't commit it, it's just, I don't. It's, and then, so you just put this in, and then when you go and run the site install, it dumps out and it tells you what the missing dependencies are. That's all it does. It just made my life a lot easier. And it's nice with Composer now because you haven't got core committed anyway. So it just makes it, and you can see that I forgot to export the field storage in this case. Go and do that as well. So basically going back to the gotcha. This whole process of the default config and all that manual process exporting the update manager, I wouldn't have to do any of it if I could have just exported the config in bulk and re-imported it to another site. I don't know if there's a solution to that. that this is the process that we went about with the install profile. And so that's about it. Because of this UUID issue, I got this process for working with an install profile. So it'd be interesting to talk with some people, see if they think they've got some other ideas on how you'd go about the same process, if this same site issue could be resolved or not, and it'd be interesting to have a chat on the panel and see what other issues come up with that. So, thank you very much.